Our next panel, Scoreboard, U.S.-China Biotechnology Competition, will be moderated by David Lin, Senior Director for Future Technology Platforms at the Special Competitive Studies Project. Please welcome our panelists, Liza Tobin, Managing Director at Garnaut Global, Michael Kuiken, Distinguished Visiting Fellow at the Hoover Institution, and Doshi, Director of the China Strategy Initiative at the Council on Foreign Relations.
All right, good morning. Can everyone hear me? My mic just fell off here. Good morning. I'm excited to share the stage with three esteemed China experts this morning, and what I want to do is really make this panel, as it seems to be the panel of the day that's really focused on China. Biotechnology stands out uniquely in the strategic rivalry because it represents a convergence point of multiple different technologies: AI, energy, advanced manufacturing, advanced networks, compute, all into one. Moreover, China's state-driven innovation ecosystem contrasts pretty sharply with the US model, which is government-supported but largely private sector-led. And each of these innovation models, US and China, carries inherent advantages, disadvantages, opportunities, and vulnerabilities. And understanding these dynamics clearly reveals different policy levers that policymakers can pull, policy opportunities that Congress can undertake. And so that's something I really want to dive into with the panel in the context of US-China tech competition as it pertains to biotech specifically. So let's dive right into it. I'll start with the first question to Mike Kuiken. During your time on the Mike Hill, you spent a lot of time pushing through legislation on AI, on semiconductors. You're one of the chief architects of the Chips and Science Act. From your perch, and having seen all these issues go through Congress, what makes biotech unique? What makes biotech different from all these other critical emerging tech sectors?
Thanks for the question, David. It's always eerie to hear yourself talking over a microphone. First, let me just say thank you to Senator Young and Vice Chair Rozo. I think they did an amazing job pulling this together, as did all the other commissioners. Thank you for their work. Having now been on the China Commission, I know these commissions take an extraordinary amount of time, so thank you very much for your service. To your question, David, the way I've sort of thought about this, sort of watching sort of Chips and Science come together, watching some of the other things that I worked on the Hill, is that it's not that biotechnology itself is actually different. It's just that what's happening around it is different. So the way I've thought about this is chemistry, physics, AI. The United States has developed the technology, built the industry around it, written the rules of the road, and essentially has built sort of the operating system for this entire ecosystem. What's happening with biotechnology is not the same. Right now, China is crushing us, and they are building the infrastructure. They are innovating. We're seeing already that their flywheel in the pharmaceutical space is going incredibly quickly, and so this should send a chill down our spine as we think about this. We have effectively written the rules of the road, developed the ecosystem, developed the entire industry in all of these other spaces, and right now what's happening in biotech is not the same. And so Michelle and Senator Young and the other commissioners have come up with sort of a roadmap to say, okay, folks, if you want to change that trend line, if you want to have a serious conversation about how we reestablish American leadership or Western democratic leadership in this space, here's the roadmap and here's what we should do. That's how I've thought about it.
I want to pivot a little bit to the topic of the day, the week, the past month, tariffs. Liza, and I've had to rewrite this question several times over the course of the week, but
you may have to rewrite it now.
Yeah, that's right. I need to check the phone real quick. But through the ups and downs, through the changing narrative, or the evolving narrative that we've seen over the past week or two, the one constant has been China. We've seen tariffs consistently go up on China that the Trump administration is pushing. And we're neck deep in a full-blown trade war currently. So this will have ripple effects across all industries. Biotech is among them. So help us kind of understand what's going on right now. What do you think are the Trump administration's ultimate aims? And where do you see, from even the Beijing perspective, where they want this to go?
Yeah, thanks, David, and thanks so much to SCSP and the Commission for inviting me to speak. So I think we're at an inflection point, and we'll start to see the emergence of a new global economic order in the forthcoming weeks and months. Last week, of course, President Trump declared a trade war on the entire world. And markets went crazy. Businesses just want certainty to know where to invest. Where should biotech companies or pharma companies build their next manufacturing plants? It seems like you can't go anywhere to escape the tariffs except here in the US. But then just yesterday, everything changed where Trump announced a 90-day reprieve on most of the world for most of the tariffs, but singled out China and left these astronomically high tariffs in place. So, we may see some kind of a deal, maybe we will, maybe we won't, that could bring these sky-high tariffs on China down to something perhaps lower. But it's probably going to be a lot higher than the rest of these countries. So a lot is going to change as we see countries line up to negotiate and bring down the tariffs, and we'll probably have some kind of low tariff wall on all countries, but relatively much higher on China. So are we seeing the emergence of a isolate China strategy coming out of President Trump? Clearly, he is of two minds. He's instinctually a deal maker, but also has these strong decoupling instincts from his first term when I was in the White House, and he turned on a dime in March 2020 amid the chaos of COVID and said, hey, we just can't do business with China anymore. This is too dangerous. And then that kind of turned the tide. So are we at that moment again where he's turning from deal making to decoupling? I'm not sure. We may see a deal, but the point is that whether or not we see a deal doesn't really matter so much as the fundamental incompatibilities of the two economic systems are becoming more clear to everyone, including President Trump, and so we're probably going to end up with these higher tariff walls. What does it mean for biopharma? Of course, just a couple days ago, Trump, I'm going to read this quote from President Trump. He's linking his threats of tariffs on pharma, which haven't come down yet, but he keeps signaling that they're coming. He links them to China. We're going to tariff our pharmaceuticals. And once we do that, they're going to come rushing back into our country because we have the big market. The advantage we have over everybody is that we're the big market. And we're going to be announcing very shortly a major tariff on pharmaceuticals. So he's been getting more and more frustrated on China. And he's seeing evidence that his tariff threats are working because pharma companies are announcing new manufacturing plants, FDI pouring into the United States to build new plants. Now, what we don't know yet, if he is going to be wise enough to bring our allies and partners into this strategy and keep those trade barriers low so that we can be working with our allies and partners to build a bigger market for our biotech and biopharma products. We'll be watching that play out in real time as these negotiations proceed.
Yeah. Maybe moving to Rush. On the China side, we've seen, again, beyond tariffs, China taking other retaliatory measures against the US in response to the tariffs, including some punitive measures. Over the past month or so, we've seen China target specific US companies, largely in the drone sector, but some in the biotech sector. Yes. You literally wrote the book on China's rise to global supremacy or ambitions. What can we expect from China going forward in terms of retaliation and reactions to the current trade war?
I think that we're in uncharted waters in the global economy. What is occurring now is probably the most significant international economic event since the US went off the gold standard in the 70s. And I don't think anybody can say with great confidence where it'll go. I mean, again, 24 hours ago, literally 24 hours ago, we did not think that we were going to be able to drop tariffs, essentially delay the tariffs on the rest of the world. As Liza mentioned, we were declaring a trade war on everyone. And now, of course, it's mostly focused on China, and we don't know what it'll be tomorrow. But what I think we should be careful to do is not underestimate China. And they have a lot of cards that they're going to play in the period ahead. They've played some. For those in the biotech space, you probably noticed that they took action against Illumina last month, and then again more recently. That's a big manufacturer. They have huge market share in China. They have manufacturing facilities in China, in part hoping, I think, that if they built the plants in China, then they wouldn't face punitive retaliation from China in the future. But that bet did not pay off. They built that plant in 2022, I think, and then now they've been banned from being able to export their products to China. So they lost the market share, but maybe they transferred some of the capital equipment. That is the classic devil's bargain that companies have made repeatedly in the United States and Europe over the last 30 years, and almost every time it doesn't work out. The China cycle, as some call it, comes for you in the end. In terms of Chinese retaliation, I think you can imagine the Illumina case being a good example, and I use that case because this is a biotech crowd, but you can imagine that being true for a variety of other sectors as well. You could imagine China perhaps not just going back by lifting tariffs, but also by pursuing regulatory action against US companies, investigations, corporate raids, the use of the anti-monopoly law, supply chain warfare. And again, from the bio perspective, we know that China has about a 90% market share in fermented APIs, right? So for a lot of our antibiotics, they have decisive market share. That was not true 20 years ago. 20 years ago, India was a major supplier of some of those same fermented APIs. So it wasn't just that China wrested the market share from the United States. They wrested it from other developing countries through industrial policy. They dominated their home market and they dominated markets abroad. They could go after our access to those APIs. They could go after our access, as they are doing now, to critical minerals. And they could go after our access to certain older microelectronics that we don't manufacture anymore. So they have all those tricks up their sleeve. Let me end with this. And not to plug something that I've just written, but I'm going to do it. You'll forgive me. But my old boss, Kurt Campbell, and I have a piece out today, came out today in Foreign Affairs. It was written some time ago, but I think the timing is pretty fortunate, which makes three arguments. That the rise and fall of great powers is usually a product of whether or not you can achieve scale, right? Whether you can get size and convert size to scale. Great Britain couldn't keep up with us because we had size and scale, and they didn't have it. They were an island off the northwest corner of Europe. The second argument is that China today has scale, and the US doesn't have as much. China is 30+ % of manufacturing. You can quibble with the statistics, but they're number one in active patents. They're number one in top-cited publications. And that wasn't true 20 years ago. And the only way that the US can get scale today, the third argument, is with its allies and partners. So this trade war that we're seeing, it can land in a reasonable place if we're able to get allies and partners to come in with us on the China question. If I could just put an addendum on that, bio is a critical part of this, because if you look at where the US still has dynamism, growth, exports, and real leadership, it's only in a handful of sectors, and bio is at the top of that list. So if the US does, as Mike mentioned, gradually lose its leadership in biotechnology, the blow isn't just to us technologically, it's to us as a modern economy that can compete in the 21st century and deliver prosperity for our citizens. I'll stop there.
David, please. I don't have a publication to plug like Rush does today.
You'll get there, Mike.
Don't worry. The one thing I do want to just mention, Rush, no pun intended, rushed to talk about API in the biotech space. This is the problem that we had on Capitol Hill too, is if you said the word biotech, everyone says pharma. Yeah. It's a dramatic problem. If you read through this report, and if you've talked to the commissioners, and if you listen to some of the previous panels, the real opportunities in biotech are way beyond pharmaceuticals. So Rush is absolutely right to sort of point out API and our dependencies there, and the transition that's happened from India to China. But you have to unlock your minds about all of the other things we can do with bio. If you saw the presentation from the lady up here about sort of bio being able to separate various chemicals and things like that, just go to West Virginia and Tennessee and think about some of these coal trailing ponds or lakes that exist and have been there for generations. Imagine if you can take that technology and do that kind of work on those trailing lakes and sort of unlock, who knows what's in those things and who knows what you can unlock. So, while I understand that the pharmaceutical industry plays a huge role in biotech, it is critical to look beyond this area. And it's one of the areas that on the US-China Commission that we're really thinking about. How do you think about the non-pharmaceutical biotech space? And how do you think about the sort of technology stack in that area? How is it similar? How is it different? Where does the US and our partners and allies have sort of a leadership role? And where are we already sort of losing those capabilities? Sorry, David.
No, sure. I want to pull on this thread that you mentioned, Rush, about scale. China, thanks to its mass industrial manufacturing base, is able to scale and deploy things very quickly. And as we look across the strategic landscape, across critical industries, critical technologies, China seems to be everywhere all at once. Biotechnology, energy, advanced networks, there's a huge Chinese incumbent sitting there ready to compete, gobbling up global market share. One of the things that we've advocated for at SCSP, and it's reflected in the NSCEB report, is getting the government organized, getting the bureaucracy, getting the institutions organized. One of the key recommendations of the NSCEB report is the standing up of a national biotech coordination office. NSCAI, National Security Commission on Artificial Intelligence, advocated for the standing up of a technology competition council, just to get the policy apparatus organized. If you look across US government, look across the Chinese government, from a zooming out at a top-down or in a big picture sense of the word, from an organizational perspective, what are China's strengths and weaknesses? What are America's strengths and weaknesses from an institutional organization perspective? Free for all on the panel. Who wants to go first? Maybe.
Can I do the first part of it, or
yeah.
Liza? Go ahead, Liza.
Oh, sure. Thanks. Thanks for the question. Yeah, I think what we need going forward is some combination of the Biden and the Trump approaches to industrial policy. One of America's great superpowers is disruptive innovation. And so there's a potential that the disruption that a Trump administration is bringing could clear the path for a new economic order, new economic relationships with allies and partners and adversaries that's more in our long-term interest. But we're not there yet. It's not really clear if we're going to end up with disruption, clearing the path of old assumptions that we can be freely trading and knitting together our biotech economies with the strategic adversary. I mean, I think most American companies realize that's no longer a long-term winning bet, but they want some certainty. If there's going to be tariff walls, they just want to know. They just want to be able to work within the restrictions that the American government is putting in place. And so right now there's no certainty. We don't know what's going to happen tomorrow from the Truth Social posts. And what the Biden administration got right was there is a role for industrial policy. Industrial policy is not a bad word. It's also not inherently good. There's still some problems. There was a half-hearted effort in the last few years to reduce our dependence on China for PPE, which we found ourselves without during COVID. And we're actually more dependent than we were on China at that time. And that was because of kind of a failure of government coordination. So there is a role, and I think Operation Warp Speed is an example of government, sort of top-down leadership in industrial policy done right. And so we need an approach that kind of mixes the good that the Biden administration brought to industrial policy with the Trump administration's willingness to challenge outdated assumptions. So I think I'm always a little bit reticent to recommend some kind of organizational body is going to solve everything. You're just going to be moving the same people to different places. And so that might be the right help, but the question is, can you balance like the best of industrial policy with the best of disruptive innovation?
Mike,
the only thing I would say is that I think having somebody that is sort of the focal point is a good idea. I agree with Liza, creating new things, and we thought about this a lot in Chips and Science. Do you create a new agency to do this, or do you put it somewhere else? We ultimately came down to the point where it was, if we start something else, it's going to take 18 months to stand up, and then it's going to have to staff up, and then we have to sort of go through that process. So I think identifying a belly button who already exists is always good. I think the way the commission wrote the recommendation is great. The thing I would say, just listening to Liza's response, which I agree with completely on sort of the industrial policy front and all the comments she made, I would say I think the Trump administration would have a reflexively negative reaction to anything that smells like COVID, like sort of a COVID response or a pandemic response. I also think that there's a biosecurity community within the biotech space that is also very active. And so if they were to sort of bite onto this recommendation, which would be fantastic, down on it on a way that sort of says, we are doing biotech, we're figuring out how we accelerate innovation in this space, we accelerate U.S. leadership, and the sort of pandemic community and biosecurity community needs to continue to exist and do all of its roles, but like the purpose of this is to accelerate American leadership.
I think I would add just maybe 2 points. First, I think to build on Liza's comment, you saw in the Biden administration, a real effort on industrial policy in a few key sectors. In the Trump administration now, you see less emphasis on industrial policy, more emphasis on tariffs and deregulation. But the reality is you actually need all of those tools together to be successful in sort of getting the lead in the high technology spaces. You need a combination of industrial policy with some degree of tariffs, with some degree also of deregulation, so you can build, for example, plants much faster. And I think that challenge of bringing sort of Democratic and Republican approaches together is the challenge of the moment now. So I guess a kind of broad point on scaling is you've got to use all the tools. And the second point I would make is China does. China does use all the tools. China has essentially been able to achieve leadership in, there's a report by ITIF, the think tank, that basically looks at innovation. And they look at China in 10 sectors, right? And they say in the 10 advanced sectors, China has achieved leadership in 6 of the 10, or not exact leadership, but is now at close or just behind the leading edge in innovation. And the formula for that essentially is a combination of massive subsidization with some degree of protection to basically create these state champions with competition at home, so they go after each other, and the survivors of that vicious competition then go over and take over global markets. And if you look at the amount that China is spending on industrial policy, depending on your estimate, it's $400 billion a year. That would be a fairly conservative estimate right now. $400 billion a year to support its industries. And our Chips and Science Act, and Mike did good work on it, is only $50 billion, of course. So you look at that delta, and you think to yourself, how do you compete with that level of scale? I think that Senator Young and Vice Chair Rosa did amazing work in this Biotech Commission report. I did read the entire report, and I found the recommendations extraordinarily sensible, so I have nothing further to add based on what Mike and Liza said. But just to frame for everybody else here the scope of the industrial challenge, there is a power out there, even in this trade war, maybe even after, especially because of this trade war, investing in scale in a way that the United States cannot and has not done before. And that does have implications for markets. And they're going to export to third country markets. So if the US does cut itself off those third country markets, including in biotech, then we only have our own market, and that is not enough to achieve scale. So you asked a question about the organization of the US government. Others answered that fairly well. I think my only other point there would be that we have to ask a larger question about what the institutional architecture will be in this country for industrial policy. Will it be done on an ad hoc industry basis, as with Chips and Science was, or is there some other way we can do it? And I don't know the answer to that question, but those are the kinds of questions we have to think about to keep up with China.
David, we actually had a hearing. It was called Made in China 2025. Sort of who is winning was the title. Liza was actually one of our witnesses, and I'm going to give a short intro on Liza's comment, but she should build on it. But this has really stuck with me. Not only, to all of Russia's points, is China investing in scale, they're also investing in how do they accelerate their ability to do these things. And Liza had this incredibly compelling point about investments in robotics, investments in automation. And if you think about everything Rush just said, and then you think about taking the human out of the loop in terms of the manufacturing and the innovation, you can even get that flywheel going faster. So if you think $400 billion a year, you think investments in advanced manufacturing, and they're doing the same thing in biotech in Shenzhen, get ready for some dramatic changes in the global economy.
Just to build on that, one out of every two industrial robots that was installed in China. The recent 2 sessions in China made embodied artificial intelligence a top priority. I think the question for them is not, is their demographics going to slow them down? The question for them is, can they replace that demographics with automation? Yep. And if you look at them in this industry, right, in robotics and in embodied AI, they may have the lead, and that'll have all kinds of follow-on effects in industry after industry.
Yeah, thanks, Mike, and just a shout out to SCSP, because that testimony drew on the well of SCSP work that we and the team, when I was still there, did on robotics and advanced manufacturing. Yeah. So I had a deep well to drink from, but thanks.
Just a little over 2 minutes left here, but I wanted to talk briefly about, we talked about organizational levels, policy moves, moving one level down to actually policy actions. Going back to the NSEUB report, it pointed out a couple policy levers the USG can pull to push back against China's unfair market practices. CFIUS reform, requiring companies to identify, supply chain vulnerabilities, things like that. What are some of the key tools in the USG economic statecraft toolkit that you think are particularly relevant to the biotech sector, or just in the strategic tech competition writ large?
Sure, so as a country, we've gotten really used to using tools like export controls and investment screening. Those have maybe narrow applicability to biotech, but I think we're going to have to lean on squishier tools that have less clear black and white lines, stronger research security, things like that. And I think with research security, the idea is not that we are completely walling things off in a black and white function, but just as, in the 90s and early 2000s, everyone had to start getting used to cybersecurity. This is just kind of a best practice that has to evolve over time. How do you keep science safe? How do you safeguard science and put best practices in place so that we're not inadvertently transferring dangerous knowledge to an adversary? These are just kind of practices we all have to learn and adapt.
Yep. Go ahead. Rush.
No, I agree with everything Liza said, and I think those are exactly the kinds of questions that we're going to have to tackle. The human security element is really complicated. It's very hard to do. You can go in the wrong direction, you can cut off the supply of really bright minds in the country, or you can be too permissive and end up having significant compromises. There's really not a clear solution to that problem. So there are all kinds of ways in which you can incentivize institutions to be more careful with who they partner with, how they partner. There can be ways in which you compartmentalize research based on nationality. And all those kinds of solutions have to be considered. But ultimately, we have a very open system. It's our comparative advantage. It allows us to move faster in innovation, but it also creates vulnerability when others can steal that innovation. And there are some recommendations, I think, and we don't have enough time to get into them, that allow you to thread the needle. But that's one of the challenges I think is most significant.
Mike, why don't you have the last word?
You're going to let us go over, David? You might get in trouble. Listen, I think what Liza and Rush said is right on. I think there's sort of a suite of tools that we've used historically. I think they undoubtedly always need to be sort of, scrubbed off and sort of imagined in new ways and thought about how we can leverage them differently. I don't think there's any perfect answers. One of the things that I've thought about in terms of the work of the China Commission has been, how do we take the sort of export control community and do what we did to the sanction community after 9/11 to sort of operationalize it and have sort of better integration between the intelligence community, law enforcement, and that community, the export control community, that is. So, there's some opportunities there. And we also had some recommendations in the commission, but all 4 of us are going to get in a lot of trouble if I keep going.
Okay, well,
right.
I think we'll end on that note, getting in trouble. Thank you all for your time and attention. Thanks for the panelists for your time.
Thank you.
Thank you.